Ah, I have not yet found thee. Rise high in the sky to illuminate my darkness. Be the pole star to my searching mind, directing me to thyself, for therein I know lies my home. Om, peace. Amen.
Good morning. I'm reading from Rays of the One Light. These are, thank you, commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda and based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Thank you. This week's reading is entitled, In Surrender Lies Victory. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. A case might be made for surrender as a path to victory in worldly conflicts, the way of passive resistance, for example, in preference to armed resistance. But our point here concerns a higher kind of surrender, the surrender of our deluded, egoic will to the wise and almighty will of God. Human will is, as Yogananda used to say, guided by whims and limited understanding. The divine will is in harmony with every level of reality. Though the divine will sometimes appears at first to be wrong, it proves always, eventually, to be for our highest good. Human will is inconsistent. It leads us one day to success, another to disaster. The divine will, when we surrender to it completely, though it is not always easy to do, always brings us deep inner peace and joy in the end. Jesus demonstrated this perfect surrender to God's will in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before he was captured, imprisoned, preparatory to his crucifixion. He went apart from the others to pray and asked them to pray also. But when he returned to them, he found them asleep. Out of his love for them, he excused them, saying, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." He urged them again, saying, "Watch and pray." Their weakness in those circumstances was particularly sad, and the disciples themselves must have regretted it bitterly later on. We all know the symptoms of human weakness, though we may excuse them in ourselves, saying, "Well, after all, I'm only human." But what are the signs of true strength? We find in all cases that these are the fruit of a life wholly surrendered to God. The Bhagavad Gita lists these signs, and they are humbleness, truthfulness, harmlessness, patience, honor, reverence for the wise, purity, constancy, control of self, contempt for sense delights, self-sacrifice, perception of the inherent evils in mortal life, certainty of ill in birth, old age, and frail mortality, disease, the ego's suffering, and sin, detachment, lightly holding thoughts from outer concern for the home, children, and wife, those ties which bind most men. An ever tranquil heart, heedless of good or adverse fortune, with the will upraised to worship me alone unceasingly, loving deep solitude and shunning noise of foolish crowds, calm focus on the inner self, perceived within and in infinity. These qualities reveal true wisdom, O Arjuna. All that is otherwise is ignorance. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. When I think of the word surrender, I remember a story that I read many years ago. And it was about an American Indian tradition of rite of passage. So, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but anyway. What would happen is each young person who was about to become an adult would go through this rite of passage, and they would go alone with one of the adults in a canoe, and they would go to this secret place where the river came together and formed a whirlpool in the water. And there was a sheer rock coming down to that whirlpool. And I don't know whether they were told to jump into the whirlpool or if they were thrown in, but at any rate, they were in the whirlpool, and if they fought back, they would drown. But if they surrendered to a natural force much greater than their own strength, then that whirlpool would suck them down, go under the rock into a calm pool of water in which they could just get out and walk back to the canoe. So, in this case, fighting back equaled death. Surrendering equaled life. And when we think of the spiritual path, surrender is life. Surrender is joy. Surrender is everything we've ever wanted. And fighting back is tension, suffering. I had a great, vivid experience with this. Twice, well, quite a few times, we have been asked to do different things, like we were asked to come to Sacramento and be with all of you. In 1985, I was asked to go to Italy and help the growing work there. And it was a shock. Because in those days, I think it's better now, but in those days, nobody spoke English. And I couldn't communicate. I was terrible. I tried to learn Italian, but I was basically terrible. And so it was very frustrating and difficult for me. Everything was so different. But after 2 years, I came back to America, but that experience in Italy was extremely helpful, because then a few years later, we were asked to go to India. And India, too, was a shock to the system. I had never been there before. I remember, as an American, trying to get things done, and I couldn't. And I have a friend over there, his name is Mahesh Ori, and we talked about this at one point. He said, yeah, I lived in America for a while, but I couldn't stand it. It was so hard to get anything done. It was a different culture, and I didn't understand. And I remember the worst part of being there in those early days was that I was used to driving everywhere. And we didn't have a car, so we had to take taxis in those first couple of months. We eventually got a car. But still, the taxi drivers did not speak a word of English, and I had no words of Hindi at all. So it was very frustrating. And I remember one day I had called a taxi. He was late in coming, which made me potentially late for the thing I had to go to. So he finally pulls up. I get in the car, and the music is blaring, just making your hair stand on end. It was so loud. And then he goes, 1 minute, and he gets out of the car and leaves. And I'm sitting there going, I can't believe it. My frustration is rising. And it was not an air-conditioned car, so I'm sitting there in the heat. I roll down the window. I'm leaning outside of the window. This music is blaring. And the music was actually really fun music and very beautiful. And because it was so loud, I think it started to break down some of my resistance. It was very interesting. And then I saw a beautiful white cow walking down the road towards me. And this cow was just so beautiful, so regal, so calm. And she came right up to me and put her face in my face. And I surrendered right there. India won. It won my heart. I just, on some soul level, I just accepted. And then it all started to get better after that. So that's surrender. In surrender lies victory. We had a work day yesterday at the Forest Hermitage. And one of the Kriyabans, one of the devotees, drove all the way from San Francisco just to be with us at that work day. And I realized in the course of the day, it was not glamorous things we were doing. We were picking up sticks and fallen dead branches and putting them in a burn pile and raking and filling in a trench, just simple things. But I realized why so many of the friendships that I've had in my life have come through working together at work days. Because you're not thinking about, I need to do this so I can get paid this amount of money. I need to do all my own things and get my own trip together, my own house, my own family. Like the Gita says, the ties which bind most men. You're just giving, and you're open. And so God's energy can just flow through you. That universal energy is always flowing into our bodies through the medulla. It's always animating us. It's giving us every breath. It's not our energy, it's energy, universal energy. But if we take that energy and turn it towards us, what I want to do, my car, my stuff, my everything, it crimps that flow and it backs up the energy until it's stagnant. But if we let that flow out, through us and out, with a giving attitude. Dharmadas, when we lived in India, went on many tours just by himself or with one other person. And I remember the time he took Haridas with him. Some of you may remember Haridas. He was here in Sacramento years ago. And afterwards, I never forgot Dharmadas's comment about Haridas. He said, The guy was either meditating or sleeping, or he was trying to help. That was his mindset. He was just trying to help. And the more that we have that consciousness, the happier we are. I was very blessed to read in my early 20s the statement, I don't know where it came from, but it was the truth, and it's stuck with me all these years. You will never be happy until you serve something greater than yourself. Now, why is that? Why is that? It's because when we feel that flow going through us, it was like yesterday at the workday. There was no tension, there was no hurriedness, there was no thought of anything except helping. And so people meet on that level of consciousness where you're just giving. And suddenly the world is beautiful. God's energy is flowing through, and the level of our consciousness is what defines our experience. I mean, I could, and I have, I could be out there picking up sticks by myself. I've been working on that creating that burn pile off and on for weeks. And my consciousness was always pretty good, and I enjoy that kind of thing. But it wasn't the same as connecting with other people while you're doing it. And that's where the friendships come in. And that's where the flow of energy gets elevated. I could hardly sleep last night because my consciousness was so filled with joy. So let's work on our attitude, our consciousness. Like this little affirmation was saying, instead of thinking what you're aware of, think are you aware with? So that, as Yogananda said, this world is a nest of trouble. But with God, it becomes a nest of fun. So I will just close with something that Swami Kriyananda grew up in the 40s. And so he knew popular music from that time period. He became a monk in 1948. But he still remembers some of those old songs, and what he would do is spiritualize them, spiritualize the words. And so they would, instead of talking about human love, they would talk about divine love. So this song, I'm going to read a few of the lyrics, is called I Surrender, Dear. And what we're surrendering is the ego. What we're surrendering is pain. Who needs it? Let's let it go. And what we find when we surrender is God's love. So the words are pride, the ego. Pride, that sad, splendid liar, sworn enemy of love. Pride kept my lips from saying things I was thinking of. But now my pride you've humbled, I've cast it to the winds. Broken, beaten, sick at heart, my confession begins. You and I, we've played a game of stay away, but it cost more, far more than I can pay. Without you, I can't make my way. I surrender, dear. When stars appear and shadows fall, why then you'll hear my poor heart call to you, my love, my life, my all. I surrender, dear.
Nirmala mentioned the workday yesterday, and I'll segue onto that a little bit. When we went up there, it was raining. It had rained a little bit here, and then was, raining more on the way. And driving up, you're looking at these clouds, and it's like, oh, what are we driving into here? And actually, it ended up being a lovely day. It was just a little bit of mist and not enough rain to really slow us down at all. But my job yesterday was working on the trench and filling up this trench, which is a good 125 feet, 150 feet long, 2 feet deep, and about a foot wide or so. And, if you add up the numbers there, it's a fair amount of work filling that in. I mean, the dirt was all just to the side of the trench, but, you're moving some earth around. And because we got there earlier, we had our muffins and our cup of tea and little fruit or whatever at the start. So I headed down the hill, and I was the first one to get down there. So I just started in, and, first with a shovel. And, after about, between 5 and 10 minutes, I had done about 1 foot. And I thought, this could be a long day. This could be a hard job. And, and then others came. And so we all were working, and we had rakes, and we had shovels and hose and, et cetera. I mean, the job is pretty simple. You want to move the earth back in the trench and fill it up as full as you can, and that's what you're doing. What was interesting is that as we got going, we were less aware of the endless long trench there, and we were more aware of there's a flow. And we're just busy working in this flow. And once that flow started, it wasn't like it was this big, onerous, heavy, hard. I mean, any given shovel full is actually not that big of a deal. Any stroke of the rake pulling stuff down the hill, again, it's not that big of a deal. You have to do about 5,000 of them, but still, I mean, it's like it's not that big of a thing, any given one. Well, by the end of lunch, or just after lunch, that whole thing was all filled in and smoothed off. And if you didn't know, you wouldn't necessarily know that there was a trench. I mean, it's only the only thing that's different now is that you can see earth instead of pine needles everywhere, and what the rest of the forest looks like with leaves and so forth. But what struck me is that trench is kind of like a whole lot of karma that needs to get dealt with. And you start in and you 5-10 minutes and you're thinking, this is going to be a long haul. And then you get in a flow. Kriya is that flow. Kriya is that flow of energy that you dive into it, you work with it, you learn to use it, and it's like the work part of it goes away and the flow part of it begins. And that blessing is for all of us, or for any who are interested enough to apply for it and apply the energy to tune into it. This morning, when you do Sunday services, you want fresh material. I was tempted to say fresh meat, but it's like to a group that has a bunch of vegetarians, that's a little less satisfying perhaps, but fresh protein, shall we say. So this morning, this is very fresh. This is like as a breakfast this morning. So I go into the kitchen. I've got the oatmeal, and I'm pouring it into my little measuring cup, okay? Well, you get distracted for a moment and you overflow the cup and it goes on the counter. Okay, well that wasn't that big of a deal. I just thought, all right, well I don't need all that, So then I go to pour the extra back into the jar where the oatmeal is. Well, then it just goes everywhere. It's just like all over the counter, in the sink, Okay, so what I noticed, now this is interesting. I thought, okay, let's observe what's happening here. I did not, there were no oaths uttered, which in other years there might have been. There was no colorful language come out, not even of thought, notably. What was there? There was just like that, just a little exhalation, like a little bit in that spirit. You clean it up, it's not a big deal, it's not a big problem. All of our lives, we have the choice in the moment, because we've all spilled the oatmeal or the milk or the whatever it is, spilled the feelings in the wrong place, that sort of thing. We can, and you notice, you learn to notice, you practice Kriya, you learn to notice, what is your breath doing? What is your energy doing? They are intimately related. And if you go, it means the energy is going down. And it's not that down is bad, it's just that down is not as much fun. And that outward sense of pushing something away, when there can be a lesson there. I'll give you another example. We will, all of us, fall down at some point. I don't want to curse anybody to fall down, because I myself have fallen down, you might have remembered, and it was not a super fun ride in the last 4 months. However, kids fall down. They spring back up. They may look around to, kind of read the house, like count the house. What are people saying? Should I cry? Should I scream? Should I whatever? It's pretty natural. The point is not the falling down. The point is, what do we do with the falling down? The point is not the oatmeal that got on the counter. The point is, what do I do? What am I gonna do? How am I gonna clean it up? And what will my attitude be? That awareness. I had a funny situation with those lines. Nirmala quoted them, and I was going to quote them anyway, so I'll quote them again. We need to change our focus from what we are aware of to what we are aware with. Okay, it's kind of subtle, because we don't necessarily think about what we are aware with. I remember, and what was funny about those lines is that years ago, Nirmala was talking about living in Italy. Well, I also lived in Italy. This was in the 1980s. And one of my jobs was to help get some of Swamiji's books published. And so I was taking one of them for translation. We were working with the translation and then getting it organized to be published. And the Italian translation of that was like, what? What you are aware of to what you are aware with? I mean, it was just, it invited this very convoluted discussion about what did it even mean? And I loved something Swamiji said about awareness in a different, this was in the Raja Yoga book. He said, and he implies it here in this reading, he says, your awareness is God's presence within you. And if you think about that, we spend so much time thinking, what are we aware of? But if we go back to the source of that awareness, and that's what he says in the reading, we're going back to God. We're going back to that bliss. And then when we say the word surrender, it's not this, surrender has awkward connotations in English. It tends to mean disaster. It tends to mean your army did not have it together. now you're surrendering. Your team flunked, you surrendered, you lost the game, whatever. And in this case, what it's meaning is that we're surrendering that instinct to fight for something limited. Whatever we decide with our hearts and our will and our intention, whatever we decide to fight for, we get to achieve. We get to keep. The trouble is, we get to win in a certain sense. The trouble is that, like the little story Nirmala was telling about the Native American tradition, if we fight, we get to keep that limitation, which in that case leads to death. Or in other situations, we fight for something, and what do we get to keep? We get to keep the limitation and the pain. And it's like, that isn't where we want to go. That's not what we want to achieve. So surrendering means not surrendering down to negative impulses or desires. It means surrendering up. Surrendering ego up into freedom and divine light. And as Swamiji very cogently mentioned, it's not always easy to do so. There's a line, I'm going to try to quote your line that I thought you were going to quote. There's a body of readings that apply to these that are longer. And we used to read them every Sunday, but Swamiji realized that people didn't want to just listen to somebody read all the time. They wanted to hear stories and they wanted to hear analysis of it in real time. But this particular line he's talking about energy and how energy flow in the consciousness leads to genius. A genius is someone who has tremendous energy moving through the mind, moving through the intellect. That's the secret of genius, having that energy and having that flow focused and directed. And then he goes on to talk about how lack of energy produces a lack of flow, a lack of consciousness. And then he summarizes it by saying, and that is the simple secret of stupidity. It's just, you're reading along and it's like, Dumpty, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, all good. And the simple secret of stupidity is no energy moving through your head. Anyway, I just got such a chuckle out of that. But we all have the choice. No one can tell us. We could be thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeon. Get my alliteration in here. Deepest, darkest dungeon. And still nobody could determine for us what our awareness would be. Swami used to love to tell the story of an Italian artist named Benvenuto Cellini. And he was a painter. And beautiful, beautiful paintings, often in lovely places of worship. And he used to paint for the Pope on commission. Well, the Pope didn't always pay him. And that just annoyed Benvenuto no end, that he wasn't getting paid for all this work. And so he went on strike. It was just like, you're not going to pay me? I'm not going to paint. Well, the Pope decided, okay, we know how to fix that. You get to go in the deepest, darkest dungeon. And so down went Benvenuto into the deep, dark dungeon, where he got 1 hour of light, enough light during that 1 hour to read the Bible for the 1 hour of his day. And after some time, the Pope relented and let him out. And what does Cellini say? He says, if you want to know true happiness, arrange to be put in the deepest, darkest dungeon, where you only get 1 hour to read the Bible every day, and you will know true happiness. That's an actual person who lived that truth in his own life because he chose. He could have just died down there. He could have given up. He could have done whatever. He chose to use that and to take whatever he could from that 1 hour out of the day, which informed the other 23, all of us can do the same. We can all choose, where do I want my awareness to live? That is our choice. No one can take it away from us. Let's live that awareness at the deepest, deepest levels where the divine is in our consciousness.